Picture this. You're standing in the shower. It's been, what, 40 minutes since you closed your laptop and left the office. The water is running, your mind is wandering, and suddenly, out of absolutely nowhere, the flawless, grammatically perfect English sentence just pops into your head.
Oh, the classic shower sentence.
Yeah, the exact, highly nuanced sentence you desperately needed during your 10 a.m. video call. And it's like, why is it that you can read C1 level technical documentation effortlessly? You can write these perfectly structured emails, but the moment you open your mouth in a live conversation, your brain just completely flatlines.
It's the ultimate betrayal by your own brain, honestly.
Yeah.
And, well, it's the sole focus of our deep dive today. We're going to pull apart the mechanics of this, the comprehension-production gap. We're looking at a huge stack of linguistic research and psychological studies to figure out why your speaking skills lag so far behind your understanding. And more importantly, we're going to hand you a 5-part blueprint to actually bridge that gap.
Yeah, because if you have ever felt like a fraud at work because your written English is stellar, but your spoken English is just this stuttering mess, we are here to tell you there is absolutely nothing wrong with you. Trying to speak a second language under social pressure, it literally feels like being asked to juggle flaming torches while simultaneously solving long division in your head.
That is a very accurate analogy.
You're trying to perform socially, and you are trying to compute linguistically all at the exact same time.
Yeah, it's basically a massive cognitive traffic jam. But, before we can get to the tools that clear that traffic, we really have to look at the machinery behind the freeze. Where do those words actually go when you need them? The first thing to understand is that the comprehension-production gap is not a failure of your intelligence. It's actually the default setting of the human brain. We see the most extreme version of this in babies. Think about it. A 1-year-old child can process and understand a relatively complex command like, go get your shoes and bring them here.
Mm-hmm.
But if you ask that same child to speak, all they can physically produce is like, ah.
Okay, wait, I have to push back on that comparison immediately, just on behalf of everyone listening. A baby has a built-in excuse.
Yeah.
They have literally been alive for 11 months.
Yeah.
I have been studying this language for 11 years.
Right, yeah.
I've done the grammar exercises. I've passed all the tests. At what point does the whole baby excuse wear off and it just becomes my fault for, not trying hard enough?
No, it's a completely fair frustration.
Yeah.
But the timeline isn't actually what matters here. It's the biological reality of how the brain processes language. The linguist Stephen Krashen famously researched what he calls the silent period.
The silent period.
Yeah, it's this phase where language learners are absorbing massive amounts of input, but their brains are essentially refusing to produce output. And researchers like Eve Clark have proven over decades of study that comprehension consistently outpaces production. Always. They are entirely separate neurological systems.
Wow, okay.
They develop on completely different timelines, they use totally different neural pathways, and they draw on different energy reserves.
So understanding a language and speaking a language aren't just like different skill levels. You're saying they're fundamentally different biological muscles.
Yes, exactly. And when you force that underdeveloped speaking muscle to perform under intense professional pressure, you trigger what researcher Elaine Horwitz defined as foreign language anxiety. Speaking is inherently the most anxiety-provoking element of language acquisition.
Which makes sense because you're totally exposed.
Totally. The researcher John Daly actually found that the fear of public speaking often ranks higher for people than the fear of heights or spiders or even death.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. Now, compound that native fear with the burden of doing it in a second language. You are facing what cognitive scientists call a dual task. A native speaker in a meeting just has to focus on performing their professional role. You have to perform that role while also actively operating the heavy machinery of a second language.
So you're carrying double the cognitive load, and then on top of that, beating yourself up for being a split second slower than the native speakers in the room.
Exactly.
That completely explains why we fall into what the research calls the translation trap. The anecdotes in our sources about this are agonizingly relatable. We have all been there. The person who panics and just confidently nods and says yes to a waiter who just asked a highly complicated question about food allergies.
Oh, yeah, the classic panic, yes.
Right. Or the person who goes to a pharmacy and instead of asking for cough syrup, which is a word they absolutely know, they've written it down on vocabulary flashcards 100 times. They just aggressively cough at the pharmacist to mimic the illness because the actual word just evaporated.
The translation trap is a symptom of system overload. My favorite, And by favorite, I mean the absolute most tragic anecdote from the sources, is the professional trying to tell their boss at a corporate dinner that they are full.
Oh, no, I remember this one.
Yeah. Instead of using the English phrase, they translate an idiom word for word from their native language. And they accidentally announce to a table of executives that they are pregnant.
That is the ultimate nightmare scenario. I would just walk into the ocean. And the real tragedy is that they owned the phrase, I'm full. It was in their brain. But under pressure, the brain bypassed the English access point, tried to carry the native language structure over word by word, and the entire thing just collapsed.
Which brings us directly to Camila's story.
Yeah.
So Camila is a brilliant product designer who lands a remote dream job at a U.S. tech company. She reads all the C1 level technical documentation without breaking a sweat. Then comes week one. She logs into a morning stand-up video call. The manager is going around the grid of 15 video boxes, asking everyone the standard startup question, what did you work on yesterday? What are you doing today?
Ugh, you can just feel the panic rising as the manager goes from person to person. It's like a ticking time bomb just moving closer to her little box on the screen.
She had a highly sophisticated multi-clause sentence completely prepared in her head. But the exact moment the manager calls her name, her mind draws a complete blank. Total whiteout. She sits in agonizing, frozen silence for what feels like a minute. Finally, she just blurts out, yes, the work is good. Today, more work, thank you. She mutes her microphone, turns off her camera, and literally cries.
The work is good. Oh man, that physically hurts to read because she knew in real time how far below her actual professional intelligence that sentence was. She sounded like a beginner, but she wasn't. So what is the actual biology of that freeze? What is happening in her brain in that specific second?
So the freeze actually have two distinct phases, emotional and mechanical. Emotionally, your amygdala, which is the brain's primitive threat detection center, it cannot tell the difference between a physical tiger attacking you in the jungle and a manager unexpectedly calling your name on a Zoom call.
Wait, really?
Really, it perceives both as a life or death threat, so it triggers a massive survival response, which quite literally pulls blood and metabolic resources away from your prefrontal cortex, which is where your sophisticated language processing happens.
Wow. So my own biology is pulling the plug on my vocabulary just to prepare me to like physically run away from my laptop.
That is exactly what is happening.
Mm-hmm.
And the second phase of the problem is mechanical. You are overloading your working memory by trying to translate and build sentences word by word. And this is where we can pivot to the actual solutions. If we know the freeze is caused by a biological threat response and a mechanical memory overload, the first two techniques in our blueprint are designed to manually override your amygdala and hack your working memory.
Okay, I'm taking notes. If my brain is interpreting a product update as a literal tiger attack, how do I shut off the alarm?
You use technique one, which is the 3-second reset. The moment you are asked a question, your instinct is to answer instantly to prove you belong there. Do not do that. First, you exhale. A long, audible exhale that is noticeably longer than your inhale. Biologically, an extended exhale stimulates the vagus nerve. This acts as a manual brake on your parasympathetic nervous system. It physically forces your heart rate to drop and signals to the amygdala that the tiger is gone.
That's amazing.
It reopens the pathways to the prefrontal cortex where your vocabulary is stored. Then, while you are still letting out that breath, you deploy a pre-planned by-time phrase out loud. Something simple like, that's a really good question. And only after that phrase is finished do you begin your actual answer.
I have to pause here because every time I hear advice to slow down, my immediate fear is that pausing makes me look lost. Like if I take a long breath and say, let me think, doesn't that just broadcast to the room that my English isn't good enough to keep up?
I get that fear, but it broadcasts the exact opposite. What actually makes you sound lost is rushing to fill the silence with panicked, high-pitched ums and ahs, or starting a sentence before you know where it's going and having to frantically backtrack. Pausing calmly, maintaining eye contact and saying, that's an interesting point, let me think about how to frame this, that is a marker of absolute native fluency. Native speakers pause constantly. They just own the pause. The pause projects confidence, not confusion.
Okay, so the breath and the by time phrase disarm the biological panic. I love that. But what about the cognitive overload? Once I do start speaking, how do I avoid that word-by-word translation trap?
That requires technique two, which is thinking in chunks. This targets your working memory, which is notoriously limited. If you approach English like an algebra equation, subject plus verb plus object, and try to pull every single word individually from your mental dictionary, you instantly max out your working memory capacity. You have absolutely no processing power left to focus on the tone of your voice or the reaction of the person you're talking to.
Right. So building word by word is like using all of your brain power to assemble the engine of a car while you are simultaneously trying to drive it down the highway at 60 miles an hour. It's completely unsustainable.
Because fluent speakers don't build cars on the highway. They rely on what linguists call lexical chunks. These are pre-assembled, unchangeable blocks of language. Instead of painstakingly finding the individual words for I see what you mean but, they just grab the entire pre-built chunk. I see what you mean but, because it is a single memorized unit, that entire phrase only takes up one slot in your working memory instead of six.
Oh, that makes so much sense. You just drop your specific meaning into a framework that already structurally works. That must free up a massive amount of mental RAM.
Exactly.
But chunks aren't completely foolproof,
Right.
right? Let's say I do the breath, I start with a great chunk, I'm halfway through a beautifully structured sentence, and then a highly specific word just vanishes from my brain. The noun is just gone. I hit a roadblock.
This is a critical pivot point, and it's where we bring in Technique 3, the Buy Time Toolkit. Silence mid-sentence is the enemy because it breeds that amygdala panic all over again. Silence makes you feel like you are failing. To survive the roadblock, you have to build a personalized toolkit of categorized phrases to comfortably fill dead air.
Like what?
You need thinking phrases like, how do I want to put this? You need clarifying phrases that pass the ball back to the other person, like, sorry, just to make sure I'm following, do you mean?
Mm.
And you need softeners, like off the top of my head.
Let's actually test that right now. Let's say we're in a meeting and I suddenly ask you a completely jarring question about quarterly projections that you definitely weren't prepared for.
All right, throw it at me.
So, given the supply chain issues, how exactly are we adjusting our Q3 revenue targets?
Off the top of my head, I'd say we need to look at the historical data first, see what happened there.
Yeah.
Off the top of my head is a psychological shield. It buys me 3 seconds of pure processing time, and it lowers your expectations. It signals that this isn't my final, perfectly polished answer. It completely removes the pressure to be perfect.
That is incredibly effective. It's so smooth. But what if the roadblock isn't a complex idea? What if the blank is just one very specific word? Like, I know exactly what I want to say, but the professional noun just evaporates.
That is when you deploy circumlocution. It sounds incredibly academic, but it just means talking around the missing word instead of freezing in place. Fluent non-native speakers are absolute masters of this. If you are in a logistics meeting and you completely forget the word bottleneck, you don't freeze and stare at the ceiling in terror. You circumlocute. You just say, we need to fix the point in the process where everything slows down. A missing word is never a crisis if you know how to paint a picture around it.
So a missing word stops being a cliff you fall off and just becomes a slight scenic detour. I love that. But what if it's not just a single word? What if my entire thought, the brilliant insight I had in my native language is just far too complex to translate on the fly?
That brings us to technique 4, and honestly, it's the most difficult technique to accept. It's called the speed of surrender. The freeze usually happens because you are aiming for a highly sophisticated level 10 sentence. You are trying to perfectly mirror the nuance of your native language. You reach for the 10, you miss, and you produce a 0. Total silence. The mechanical fix is consciously aiming for a 7. You have to strip down your complex, beautiful thought to the absolute simplest, true version of that thought.
I'm going to be honest, I have a real problem with this one.
I know everyone does.
Because if I have a nuanced strategic point about cross-departmental synergy and I drop all that complexity just to say a basic sentence, like different teams want different things, aren't I just dumbing myself down? Am I not presenting myself to my colleagues as less intelligent?
It feels that way internally, I promise you, but the external perception is the exact opposite. Surrendering to simplicity is not defeat. It is exactly what highly skilled communicators do when they are under time pressure. Think about the outcome. The basic, simple truth delivered clearly and confidently is always perceived as more authoritative than a complex, jargon-filled sentence that devolves into a panicked, stuttering freeze. A clear, confident 7 beats a frozen 0 every single time.
That is a really good point.
The speed of surrender is a superpower. The faster you let go of the perfect sentence, the faster you can grab the simple one and keep the conversation moving.
Okay, I'm sold. So we use the extended exhale to physically calm the vagus nerve. We use lexical chunks to save our limited working memory. We use the buy time toolkit and circumlocution to navigate detours. And we use the speed of surrender to just keep moving forward. These are incredible tools for when you are already in the trenches of a conversation. But how do we fix the machinery before we even log onto the call? How do we wire our brains so that grabbing a chunk is an automatic reflex rather than a conscious effort?
To do that, we have to transition from knowing about language to physically producing it. This is technique 5, building the muscle through shadowing. We really need to distinguish between declarative knowledge and procedural knowledge. Declarative knowledge is knowing a rule or a fact. It's knowing exactly how the gears and pedals of a bicycle work. Procedural knowledge is automatic, physical action. It is the ability to actually ride the bicycle without falling over. Speaking a language is procedural, and you can only build procedural speaking pathways by outputting sound.
Oh no, I think I see where this is going. So all those hundreds of hours I spent watching Netflix in English without subtitles, all those podcasts I listened to on my commute, none of that actually built my speaking muscle, did it? Because I was only ever receiving the language. Sadly, no. Listening only builds comprehension. It builds your declarative understanding. To build the physical speaking muscle, your actual mouth has to move. If you only listen, you're essentially going to the gym, doing bicep curls with your right arm for 3 years, and then wondering why your left arm is still incredibly weak. You have to work the other muscle.
That is devastating, but very fair. So how do we actually work the procedural muscle? What does a shadowing session actually look like?
It is a targeted daily physical exercise. You find a short 30-second audio clip of natural conversational English. It could be a clip from this deep dive, a YouTube video, or a business presentation. You play it, and you speak along out loud at the exact same time. You act as a vocal shadow, maybe a half second behind the original speaker. And the key here is that you don't just robotically read the words, you mimic the rhythm, you copy the melody, you hit the exact stress points they hit. If they pause, you pause.
So I am essentially forcing my mouth to navigate the physical terrain of English phrasing until it becomes literal muscle memory. Precisely. You have to do this out loud every single day. You are literally carving out the physical motor pathways for English speech in your brain. You are building a concrete bridge between the deep reservoir of vocabulary sitting in your prefrontal cortex and your vocal cords.
That makes total sense. Let's bring this all back to Camila, the designer who froze during her stand-up. What happened to her after she started using these tools?
So 4 months after that disastrous "the work is good" moment, her team's lead designer called in sick. Camila was asked, with almost no warning, to present a major new product direction to a massive external client.
Oh, wow. The ultimate high-stakes dual task.
Exactly, but this time she gets on the video call. She shares her screen, she takes a long, audible exhale, and she starts with a pre-planned chunk. "Thanks so much for joining today. I'm going to walk you through where we landed." And when the client interrupted her to ask a completely unexpected, difficult technical question, she didn't panic, she didn't trigger the amygdala, she used the reset. She said, "That's a really great question. Let me think about that for a second." She held the pause calmly, and then she delivered a clear, simple, chunk-based answer. Her manager sent her a private message immediately after the call, saying her presentation was flawless.
See, she didn't magically memorize 10,000 new vocabulary words in 4 months. She just finally built the access bridge to the words she already had.
Yes, fluency is not a magical personality trait that you are either born with or you aren't. It is a constructed skill. And every single person listening to this right now can start applying this blueprint tomorrow morning. Start small. Start with one long exhale before your first meeting and just one pre-planned chunk.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? It means you are not missing the language. The vocabulary is in there. You have just been missing the assembly instructions.
And as we wrap up, there is one final provocative question I want you to consider on your own time. Think deeply about how you operate in your native language. Have you ever noticed that even in your mother tongue, you rely heavily on filler words? You use conversational pauses. You circumlocute when you forget a word. You constantly rely on simple, good enough sentences when you are put on the spot. You never speak in perfectly crafted, highly complex grammatical paragraphs in real life.
We forgive ourselves for all those ums, ahs, and mental blanks in the language we were born speaking. We expect them. We don't even notice them. So why on earth do we demand robotic, flawless perfection from ourselves when we are speaking a second language? If you wouldn't expect yourself to seamlessly juggle while solving complex math in your native tongue, give yourself the grace of a 3-second reset in your second one.
Exactly. Let go of the perfect shower sentence.
Spot on. The words are already in your head. Now you just have to give yourself permission to let them out.